conclusion that not only was Joe Paterno framed, and of course, John has started the website and maintains the website, framingpaterno.com, but also that Jerry Sandusky was wrongfully charged, and we've got some opportunity to chat with John about the events of today and some other things. And as always, John, appreciate the time.
And always appreciate you having me on in my old home stomping grounds of Bucks County, where I grew up in Washington Crossing and went to school at Holy Ghost Prep. Let me just quickly clarify, though, as far as me going too far.
Yes.
This was not a conclusion that I came to easily or quickly.
Yeah.
I, at the beginning of this story, like everybody else, presumed that Jerry Sandusky was guilty as hell.
Mm-hmm.
But I did something that no one else did. I checked the math on the story.
Yeah.
And then I actually interviewed Jerry Sandusky twice in prison. I have exchanged dozens of letters with him. I have spoken to his wife more in the last year and a half probably than my own wife, and for better for worse. And the reality is that the evidence just isn't there. And I'm not just talking about not proving guilt.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about a case that is based in numerous fallacies, a lack of logic, a lack of common sense. There's no evidence where there ought to be evidence, and really we're living in an Alice in Wonderland upside-down world, which continues today, where because no one checked the basic math at the beginning of this story, including me, by the way, I'm as guilty as everybody, because for the first year or so, I presume something for which there is almost no evidence. And that, of course, is that Jerry Sandusky is this serial pedophile that everyone now presumes that he was. And because no one ever checked the math, and because the political realities of this case are now so toxic, we have what happened today with the Attorney General releasing a report that is delusional, absurd, highly predictable, not credible, and is easily refuted, which I have already done with an extensive video at our website, www.framingpaterno.com.
What is that, I haven't had a chance to look at the video yet, but what is that video address?
Well, I knew that Kane was coming out with her investigation of the Sandusky prosecution today. So what I did was I took the only interview that the two main prosecutors, Frank Fina and Joe McGettigan, did. This was an interview with CBS 60 Minutes Sports on Showtime with Armin Katayan last year. And I went through that interview bit by bit and blew apart their basic narrative and really exposed some of the things that they did here, which don't even pass the smell test, and things that they say that are just not based in evidence or logic or common sense. And I blow the entire case apart, and I show that what really happened here is the exact opposite of what we're being told in this media narrative. That somehow, that we've now been told that Sandusky was this long-time serial pedophile, and that he led people to his crimes by writing a book called Touched and putting pictures of victims in his book, and somehow that this was a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation where he wanted people to catch him in his crimes. And by the way, I thought that was plausible for a long time too. And then I realized it was the exact opposite. That in reality what happened was that the book was used as a way to manufacture a case where none previously existed, and that the only reason why the Attorney General's office took so long to indict and arrest Jerry Sandusky was not because of some sort of delay for politics or some bizarre conspiracy that nobody can detail or outline. It's because they had no damn evidence. Because the number one victim in this case, Aaron Fisher, who was the only evidence in this case for 2 years, was simply not reliable. And he's not reliable today. He wasn't reliable in 2009. His own friends have told me on the record still to this day, even after the avalanche of positive publicity for him, that they don't believe him. He was not to be believed for a number of reasons. And that's why they were smart not to indict Jerry Sandusky. It would have been absolute malpractice.
Have you talked to him, or do you have any hopes of ever talking to him?
I would love to talk to Aaron Fisher, but it's interesting, Daryl, because Aaron Fisher does speaking engagements across the country, except he always does two things before he speaks. There's no notice until the day before, and it's never in the state of Pennsylvania. Gee, I wonder why that is. By the way, he's also always with his therapist / co-author, Mike Gillum, who was also the therapist for the only other person. Oh, there were only two. People need to understand that. It's the most important fact in the entire case. At the time of Sandusky's arrest, there were only two human beings claiming to have had any sort of a sex act with Jerry Sandusky, and both of them had the same therapist. And I believe that what really happened with Aaron Fisher was that Aaron Fisher had these alleged memories drawn out of him by a therapist who was looking to make a name for himself in a situation where he was abused, but not by Jerry Sandusky, but by his own stepfather, who was just arrested back in December and charged with 109 counts of child molestation, including against one of his own children. And by the way, Jerry Sandusky, way before that arrest, even before his own trial, told his own attorney, Joe Amendola, that he suspected that Aaron Fisher had been abused by the stepfather. Guess, and then, lo and behold, the stepfather gets arrested on 109 counts of child molestation, including his own child. No. This is not that difficult when you look. No one wants to look at the details. I understand, because it's a messy case. It's icky. It's disgusting. You don't know one wants to think about it. Everyone presumes there's no need to look at it because we already know the truth. But no one checked the original math on the story. I checked it, and guess what? It was wrong.
Whenever John is on the program, it's always, where do you go? There's so many angles to the story, and I don't necessarily. What is your general thought about what you heard this morning in terms of the news conference, and if it is in complete contradiction to your belief that Sandusky is innocent? I don't know that we can get bogged down in a lot of the details, but what did you hear that raised some red flags for you?
There's two things people need to understand about this report today, okay? Number one, that obviously being a Democrat who was elected on this issue, Kane has a huge political self-interest to throw the kitchen sink at Tom Corbett, right? Mm-hmm. Because Corbett's running for re-election, and if, in fact, she had found any evidence whatsoever that there was a political conspiracy here or any explanation that was nefarious for why it was that Sandusky was not arrested sooner, she would have gone with it. She found nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, she's claiming that this was inexcusable, but she doesn't give a reason for it. What's the motivation? What was the motivation for why there was a delay? She's delusional in that she's pretending that Aaron Fisher was credible, which he was not, and that the case didn't dramatically change the day that Mike McQueary finally fell in their lap under suspicious circumstances in late 2010. It was only at that point that the prosecutors really thought, okay, well, maybe now we have a case because we have a non-victim witness. Now, the other thing you need to understand about this is not only does her political incentive indicate that the fact that she's not throwing the kitchen sink indicates that there is no kitchen sink, but here's what they came up with as an attempt to try to make it look like Sandusky was clearly guilty. This was extraordinary. In the press conference today, they actually strongly implied to people who already believe that Sandusky is guilty and who won't check out the facts, they implied that they found, when Sandusky's home was finally searched and computers were finally searched, that they had found pictures of children as if those pictures might somehow be nefarious or even pornographic. That is totally 110% false. They never found a shred of pornography in this case. There was never any allegation of pornography. And the fact that they have to basically lie without actually lying through implication, indicates how weak the case really is. So now somebody is supposed to be arrested as a pedophile because they have they run a charity and they have pictures of the kids who they have befriended in that charity in their home. That's an indication you're a pedophile? That's pretty scary stuff, Daryl.
And much was made of the fact that Aaron Fisher, knew something about the basement of Jerry Sandusky. I don't know that there's been, I don't even know that's a fact that they've even questioned that he was down there and he may have stayed overnight. It says, was there any sexual contact?
Well, I have been in that basement. I have done what I believe to be a very compelling video from the basement, which people can see at framingpaterno.com. Matt Lauer was in that basement with me and Dottie Sandusky after we did our Today Show interview back in March, and Matt Lauer was stunned. You can see the video for yourself at our website. Stunned to see not only was the bedroom in the basement literally 10 feet down a staircase from the kitchen, but that you could hear absolutely everything from there, anywhere in the house. This is a very small house. Jerry Sandusky was not super rich. He did not have a big house. There was no soundproofing. The basement is perfectly normal. It's exactly what you would expect in any average person's house. And the notion that somehow, while Dottie Sandusky was in the house, which is the allegation by two of the victims, that somehow there was screaming from the basement, as victim 9 claimed, which is completely absurd, and that Dottie Sandusky was unaware or didn't realize it, is just utterly, totally ridiculous, and an indication of just how weak this case really was.
Now, they point to the fact that, Janelle Eschbach, who was the line prosecutor, the so-called line prosecutor, she was in charge of the case, wanted to move forward more quickly and didn't. Right. You say there was no case there. Obviously, Eschbach, apparently, according to this investigation, felt that there was something worth charging Sandusky on.
Absolutely, you're right. But interestingly, when you read Aaron Fisher's book, it is very clear that Janelle Eschbach was his champion. She absurdly believed that somehow, at least according to Aaron Fisher's book, that somehow Sandusky was inherently suspicious because of the fact that he devoted his entire life to this charity involving boys. That to her, this somehow indicated right off the bat that Fisher must be telling the truth, because why else would Jerry Sandusky, a former famous football coach, leave that in order to go spend all of his time on the Second Mile charity? Yeah. Well, I'm as cynical as anybody, Daryl, but that's a level of cynicism that I find to be really troubling and dangerous. The reality is that Aaron Fisher tried to testify twice in front of the grand jury. He failed both times. He broke down crying, couldn't answer any questions, never told his story. He never told a story in the grand jury till the third time, Daryl, when he read his testimony, probably written by his therapist, with his therapist in the room with him. He has 4 different timelines for what occurred here. As I've told you before, his own friends to this day don't believe he's telling the truth. There was a claim at trial that he started wetting the bed when he started seeing Jerry Sandusky. Totally false. I've spoken to a parent of a friend of his who had Aaron Fisher at his home over 50 times way before he ever met Jerry, and he said he wet the bed the first night he was there, which, by the way, is consistent with the timeline of my theory that he was actually being abused by his stepfather and not Jerry Sandusky. But the reality is the only time there was ever going to be any publicity, money, or interest is if the allegation was against Jerry, but nobody came forward for 2 years. Why? Because there was nobody to come forward until investigators got McQueary, and they used McQueary and Fisher as these 2 pillars of this case. Those pillars, we were told, were made of steel. They were not made of steel, Daryl. They were made of sand. And when they disintegrate, and in my view, both Fisher and McQueary's testimony is not credible, the entire case collapses because it was those 2 stories that they used to convince other people that they had been abused when they had not been abused. This was the Loch Ness Monster. This was a situation where people never thought there was a Loch Ness Monster until other people started saying that there was one and suggesting that there was one. This case is the big lie theory in its personification, and this whole thing is the biggest injustice I've ever seen in my life.
And Eschbach acknowledged that she was interested in Sandusky, or thought she was sort of suspicious of Sandusky based on his sudden resignation as the defensive coordinator for Penn State. So she sort of acknowledged that.
This is really, really important. That entire situation has been completely misunderstood. First of all, there was an allegation in 98. Sandusky coaches for 2 more years after that allegation is found to be, quote-unquote, unfounded by the presiding authorities, including the district attorney, okay? So 2 more seasons he coaches. And then in December of 2000, he gets offered the head football coaching job at the University of Virginia. He has a contract in his hand. During the second interview with the University of Virginia, the head football coach of the New York Jets, Al Groh, who had just lost his last 3 games of the season, the Jets just missed the playoffs by a game. He had gotten in a fight with a New York reporter. Al Groh was a Virginia alumnus, and he was on the search committee for the job for the head coaching position that Jerry was being offered. He calls up in the middle of the second interview and says, hold on, don't hire Sandusky. I need the job. I'm going to get fired. I'm paraphrasing here. The next day, Al Groh gets hired. There is not a chance in the world that Jay Paterno, the son of Joe Paterno, who was a Virginia grad assistant who married a Virginia alum himself, was going to allow Jerry Sandusky to be the head football coach at Virginia if there was even the hint of suspicion that Jerry was a pedophile. It would have taken one phone call probably wouldn't even have taken a call from Joe Paterno. Jay could have done it himself. It would have torpedoed the whole idea. It didn't happen because there was no reason for it to happen, because Jerry was not a suspected pedophile, because he wasn't a pedophile. He was a guy with weird boundary issues, who looks at the world differently, who was from a different era, a different generation, and who thought he was so confident in what he was doing was right. He views himself almost as a Jesus figure, that he believed himself, he knew what he was doing was right, he was not doing anything wrong, he was arrogant about it, he was stupid about it, but he was not a pedophile, and that's the reality of this entire case.
And as John mentioned, there's a new video that's up again through his website, framingpaterno.com. One last thing is sort of a takeaway, and you've referenced this a couple of times during the conversation. Just step back a couple of steps, and you say the arithmetic. What is the arithmetic in this case that you have followed through on that others haven't or don't want to?
Great question. In November of 2011, we were told by the news media that it was absolute certainty that Mike McQueary had seen a rape, and that he had told Joe Paterno he had seen a rape, and that Penn State did nothing about that, and that Aaron Fisher was absolutely positively to be believed, that the indictments had vindicated him, and that he was telling the truth, that Jerry had sexually molested him for years. That was the bedrock of this case. Nobody questioned either of those two allegations. I have investigated both of them completely and thoroughly, and neither of them stands up to even a hint of scrutiny. As I said, they were treated as pillars of steel. They were pillars of sand. I believe the entire case after that collapses. It's the case not just against Sandusky, but also against Paterno and against Penn State. And the only way to create a logical, sensible, common-sense narrative, which is consistent with the way human beings actually react in the real world, Daryl, is that I am right, because nobody else can tell a story that makes any sense whatsoever. Not the prosecution, not the news media, nobody. And you can find it all at framingpaterno.com.
We get a caller who asked, have you interviewed either of the defense or any of the defense attorneys for Sandusky?
Oh, I've spoken to Joe Amendola extensively, yes. And I actually think that Joe Amendola is an incredibly honest guy. I think he's actually much smarter than people give him credit for. I believe that he made a ton of mistakes because he was under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I even think Joe went a little loopy. I think, and I can understand this because I've been in bubbles in the middle of a hurricane, not nearly the severe of a hurricane that he was under, but you go a little crazy when you're one person against the world, and he was one person against the entire world in a way I don't think anybody else has ever experienced, and I think he went a little loopy, and I think that's why people view him the way that they do. Obviously, in retrospect, I know Joe would have done some things differently, but Joe always acted as if he was dealing with an innocent client, not somebody who he was trying to get off on a not guilty, a Johnny Cochran type. He believed Jerry was innocent, which is, by the way, why he allowed him to do that ill-fated Bob Costas interview. Yeah. You got a guilty client. Why are you, without any preparation, on a whim, allowing Bob Costas to talk to him on the phone? By the way, I believe that interview was done under some I believe, I'm not going to make a negative comment about the circumstances, but let's put it this way. Jerry did not believe he was going to be asked as many questions as he was asked. I believe Jerry thought he was going to be asked one or two questions, and that was it. There was no preparation for that, and I believe his answer to the infamous, are you sexually attracted to young boys question was so bad, so horrendous, that it is absolutely consistent with innocence, because nobody could answer that question so poorly and be a serial pedophile and get away with it for 30 or 40 years. It's just not possible.
You've said before the last time you were on, as a matter of fact, you doubted whether there'd be a prosecution of Spanier, Schultz, or Curley. Do you still believe that?
I don't believe there's ever going to be a trial because I think that the Cynthia Baldwin issue, which is viewed as a legal technicality, is going to eviscerate the prosecution case, and I think that the prosecution is going to be thrilled that they don't have to go to trial because if they ever go to trial, they're going to be exposed as having a case that makes no sense. And here's all you need to know about why the case of a cover-up makes no sense. There was an open job for Mike McQueary when he came forward with this report, right? If there was a cover-up, the first thing that would have happened is that Mike McQueary would have gotten that open wide receiver's job. He didn't get that job. In fact, he got the very same job 3 seasons later. You don't have a cover-up without the main witness. You also don't have a cover-up without one of the 3 people who are currently under, having been charged, Spanier, Curley, and Schultz, without one of them flipping on the other. None of the 3 have flipped on the other because there was no conspiracy, there was no cover-up. Had there been a cover-up, one of them would have flipped on the other by this point, absolutely, positively, 100% assuredly, and it hasn't even come close to happening because they're innocent, and that will be proven at trial. Unfortunately, my view is consistent with the rest of this crazy case. There will be no trial, and the media and the prosecution will be able to say, well, they were probably guilty, they just couldn't prove it, let's move on. Next story, please.
FramingPaterno.com.
That's the website. All I ask is people have an open mind. I've devoted my entire life to this, destroyed my career, not made a dime from it. I have no connection to Penn State at all. I went to Georgetown. I'm only doing this because nobody else is stupid enough to do it, and no one else cares enough about the truth of this case to put their ass on the line here like I have, and all I ask is you check out the truth with an open mind, and you're going to find out that what you were told was not true.
John, we'll talk again. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Daryl.
As always. We're going to take a break.